Hello there and welcome to this vlog of June 2023, and today's video is going to be another comparison between real world history and BattleTech history. If you watched my previous video, you'll know that I did something on the failure of the clan invasion and did a bit of a cross comparison between like 20th century history, particularly the events of World War II and the clan invasion, and want to do something very similar today, but the topic or the time periods are going to be very different. So what I want to do is a cross comparison between the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, which is a real thing, and then the Ares Convention of 2412, which is a BattleTech thing. So still real, but BattleTech. Now, I've actually done this video before, but it was awful. I'll say the content, I think, was very similar to what I'm going to talk about now. The format, though, was awful. At the time, I was just kind of getting into this, and I did videos. I'd do like one a week, and I'd do like a news roundup, and then I'd do like a topic. That's really bad for kind of the future-proofing of the video, because people will just click onto it and be like, why am I listening to news that's out of date, you know, like from 2 years ago for 10 minutes? So yeah, I stopped doing that quite quickly and then just started doing videos on specific topics and just kind of, you know, my format. I go on for like 45, 60 minutes, whatever, talking about a topic, whether it's news, commercial stuff within the BattleTech world, or whether it's something like this. That's obviously a much better format. I also, at the time, I only had this channel just to meet people across the community, just so that I could, you know, like get my opinions out there, and then you get people commenting on your channel and speaking to, and you meet some amazing people doing that. So it's been a real joy for me to kind of do the videos. But at the time, it was just like, it was on like a cheap, I don't know, like $150 camera. I was in my old office back in my old house. I didn't have it in my gaming room, so it was quite a small office where I just used to kind of, you know, camp up and when I used to work from home. Now, though, obviously, because I kind of do the vodcast with the guys at Death from Above, and, you know, so I've got a better camera, I've got a much better layout. So I wanted this video to have, you know, to be at the level of professionalism that I can get it to, which is still quite low because I don't edit videos. But I think my style, my kind of like waffling on style with lots of tangents, some people really like that because I suppose it's quite, well, it's very natural. Some people don't like it, and that's absolutely grand, so to each their own. But I know that I've got a little bit of an audience for this. I've had quite a few like new subscribers recently as well. So what I'm going to do now is kind of the actual format of this channel, or was that for like a year before all the Kickstarter stuff came about again, and then all my kind of focus veers towards that. Generally speaking, I do all manner of weird and wonderful stuff, and it's just unfortunate that I talked about a lot of interesting topics early on, or what I find interesting anyway, but the format was just not something that really suits. So yeah, I might go and like redo a few of the old videos where I'm kind of, you know, I've got the new camera and it's to the new format and etc, etc. Anyway, let's get into this, because this to me is a really quite interesting topic, and if you are interested in history, then you'll probably find it interesting too. If you are interested in history, you probably know quite a bit of what I'm going to talk about. If you are passively involved in history, though, are interested in history, and you like BattleTech, still very much worth watching, I think, because I'm going to talk about a period of history that has almost been forgotten, tragically enough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the Treaty of Westphalia, the Peace of Westphalia. You can call it what you like. Signed in 1648. I'm going to give a little bit of a synopsis of that, but I'm not going to go into mass levels of depth. Obviously, this is a BattleTech channel. It's not a history channel. If you want to read about the Treaty of Westphalia, there's plenty, you know, of analysis done on it. It is, within historical circles, it's a very famous event. But it's one of those tragedies where, like, the average person in the street wouldn't have a clue what it was, and it underpins like the entirety of like Western international relations, and still kind of applies to this day in countries that have got like a, like the Western tradition, like rule of law, things like that, or the countries that were kind of born out of the Enlightenment era, like in modern Europe and the US. So, yeah, the Treaty of Westphalia. What is it? Right, so there is an event in history which I love. It's genuinely one of my, well, I say it's one of my favourite periods of history. It's absolutely horrifying, but it's incredibly interesting. That is called the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War, again, is just going to give you a absolute, not even a 101, like in what it is, but just to kind of set the ground for what I'm going to talk about. As clues in the title, it lasted approximately 30 years. It was effectively the French and the Swedes against the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was comprised of all the different German states as well. Remember, Germany didn't actually unify until the late 19th century, so before that it was just like a multitude of little kingdoms like Prussia, and there were hundreds of them, and it was, some of them were like just a city, some of them were like a province, or what in England we'd call a county, and some were effectively like countries, like Prussia, or like down if you go into Bavaria, like big enough to easily be its own country. So this war was effectively one of, up to that point it was the equivalent of, I say World War very loosely, obviously it was a European war, but in terms of what became, the dominant modern world, which was kind of born out of the European ethos or philosophy, you could, I suppose, say that there was an element of World War in there, not geographically, but you know what I'm getting at, that important. 8 million people died in it, or thereabouts. It was a war that affected civilians. It wasn't like a total war, like World War II, but the civilians absolutely got dragged into it. It was really quite horrific, and it all came about, and as with everything of that age, a lot of it was born out of religion, or the problems surrounding religion. It was something where, and again, I have to kind of set the background to the background here, but I can't really discuss this without talking a little bit about the Reformation. My American audience will be very well versed on this, I'd imagine. The Reformation, which occurs approximately 100 years before the 30 Years' War, it's when the Protestant churches, or what became the Protestant churches, like Lutheranism and Calvinism, split away from the Catholic Church, which caused a huge divide in European society. We obviously still, to this day, if you look at countries like Ireland, we still have this as a really quite significant issue in society in certain places. At the time, though, it spilled out everywhere. In the initial days of the Reformation, you had, especially if you think about Germany, in the context of Germany at the time, it was lots of little different cities or kingdoms, or, these big, what would become very powerful states like Prussia. And if they decided, overnight, if their leader just said, I quite like the Protestant faith, I'm going to turn Protestant now, and so are all my people. Well, you can imagine the chaos that then ensues in regards people's concept of their neighbour, or concept of their countrymen, or whatever else you want to say, where, you've got these countries where you've got hardline Catholics who then are living alongside Protestants who are seen as the enemy, or they kind of look at it as Satan personified, or evil on earth, or whatever else, and vice versa. You had chaos, and you would have had, situations where one state will have been hardline Catholic and decided we're actually going to go to war with our neighbour who's just turned Protestant. And obviously within smaller nations, this was as devastating, if not more so, than bigger nations, and it just swept across Europe. So England was one of the first major nations to do this, very famously through Henry VIII, where he wanted the divorce, the Pope didn't give it, so he was like, I'm suddenly a Protestant. Well, you can kind of get divorced. So, that is what it is, and Henry VIII, did what he did. Then we had So you had a country here, which is, to this day, is still a Protestant country. I mean, to say that the Brits had problems with Catholics is a bit of an understatement. I mean, I don't even think. I mean, they may have got rid of it now, but you weren't allowed to be Prime Minister or Chancellor of the Exchequer in this country if you were an open Catholic. That's, I'm guessing, more of a convention, though, because Tony Blair is a Catholic. Though when he was running for Prime Minister, it was very much like him not telling us for sure. I come from a Catholic background, so I always used to find that quite amusing. And there is still like a line of mistrust there. I mean, even to a point where, like in the royal family, if somebody rocks up with a partner who's a dyed-in-the-wool Catholic, there's probably going to be fireworks, given that like the monarch is the head of the Church of England, which is a very powerful and prominent Protestant like institution of the Protestant faith. So yeah, at the time it was like, multiply what I've just talked about there by 10 million. If your neighbour was seen to just be coercing with the devil, so to speak, you would have no problem at all going and wrapping a club around their head or burning them on a pyre or whatever else that they were, horrifying things that they were doing to each other back then. In fact, a lot of people will have seen it as their duty to do that. So it's utterly brutal, utterly horrible. And when you've got a society like, it's such a fascinating period in history, because you're right on the cusp of like, well, I mean, they're already going on. Like, you've got people going back in history like Erasmus, who's writing, 100 years before the 30 Years' War. Erasmus, one of the great humanist, writers and thinkers. And that's kind of the start of the like Enlightenment era. And then running alongside it, you've got this like really like radical form of religion, which is like burning people at the stake, and just incredible like juxtapositions of ideas and thoughts. When you really think about it, it's completely mad. Right? You're just like, how on earth did like those two like ethoses run parallel with each other to some extent? And it's, I suppose the answer's quite simple if you really drill down into it, and that's for the people of this time, there was like no difference between science and magic. Right? Or I say magic, you can say religion, say what you want. I mean, I come from an anthropological background, so I probably would say magic. Like it's like things like alchemy. Alchemy was seen as a science. For us, it's a pseudoscience at best, or what is perceived as like a magic trick or whatever else. But for our ancestors back in this period, like, I suppose the two could coexist because they didn't see a differential between science and magic. So, but that causes like a 200-year period where I don't think humanity's ever been more interesting than that. Horrifying, terrifying, but really interesting. And I would argue that the Treaty of Westphalia, like that, dispelled the magic side of this. And not just the Treaty of Westphalia, there were plenty of other things going on. But for me, the Treaty of Westphalia is just such an integral, important part of like the birth of the modern age and modern human beings that have kind of, that have liberated themselves from the kind of the shackles of like superstition and dogma, and are much more prone to kind of basing decisions on like empirical data and analysis and evidence, things of that ilk. So you've got this like tinderbox of this horrifying war that, and it, again, I'm not going to go into the details of the war as such. It was a religious war in context. So, and you said, I mean, most religious wars have got underpinnings of an excuse. So there's like economics or rivalries or something going on. And that was certainly the case here. And I'm not going to get into it because it kind of really goes outside the context of this video. But the Treaty of Westphalia then, kind of, after 30 years of just bloodshed and chaos across continental Europe, it was just decided, I mean, and this is the Treaty of Westphalia is a big document, and you can go and read it, and analyse it, but ultimately what it says is, if your neighbour meaning like the state or the country next to you, decides that they suddenly want to be Protestant or Catholic, that is not a legitimate reason for you to declare war on them. And as simple as that notion sounds, it's earth shattering for the, like the way that humanity then perceives itself and the people around it. Like, now at the time, obviously this will have taken time to distill into the general population. You kind of have the elite of society, like the rulers or the politicians, the people in the church. They're signing this document, but then if they're not the ones, they're the ones that control, the armies and everything that goes with that. If they're then willing to sign this and not do it, then eventually, just through like social osmosis, this message gets across. You've then kind of got this coupled with the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is very famous for kind of starting up schooling systems. So if you've got, and I'm not saying you don't get kids in the 18th century and start teaching them about the Peace of Westphalia, but just by osmosis, things move from a more superstition mindset to a more rational, empirical, database mindset. And that's the key here, that the Treaty of Westphalia for me is one of those like really seminal moments in like human history where things just change because of this edict. And that's where, like, looking at it historically, and it's not just the pragmatics of it stopping wars. So, for instance, it ends the 30 Years' War and all the issues and all the wars that France are having. Actually ends a war between the Dutch and the Spanish, which is a really interesting war that goes on for decades and decades, all based on, it's religion, but underpinned by economics and expansionism and territorial rights and things of that nature. But again, another forgotten war, really, the Dutch-Spanish War. And I mean, I think I read like an article years and years ago just saying that like it was one of another really important was the kind of the Dutch liberation of that, because the Dutch were very much like a scientific, they're like the English of the continental mainland, right? Like they like to keep out of trouble. They don't have a big land army, and contrary to popular belief, Britain has never had a big land army. Our power base is based on commercial exploits and navy. We have always used other people to fight our battles, and our army is relatively very small. The Dutch were similar to that. Like, they kind of got their influence through soft power, which is something I talked about in the last video that I did. So, and the Dutch ascendancy in that relationship. Spain was a very superstitious, like, at the time, very old-fashioned country, and the Dutch were the absolute opposite from that. So, that things like that and things like the Peace of Westphalia just really kind of laid the foundation stones down for a change in people's like ethos, particularly in Europe. I think I would argue without like the Peace of Westphalia, you wouldn't have like the foundation stones for like the French Revolution, the American Revolution. It's that important. But so much gets spoken about with the French Revolution and how the French Revolution defines the modern world to this day. Yet the Peace of Westphalia, I think, is just almost cast aside, which I find quite sad. It's one reason I'm doing this. I kind of have it as a secondary objective to discuss things like the Peace of Westphalia or the forgotten things from history. And obviously, if I can then tie that into a BattleTech thing, and that will segue us now into the Ares Convention, then all for the better. So let's have a look at the Ares Convention then, and bring this to a tie it into BattleTech, which is what this channel is really about. So the Ares Convention is, everybody knows about it, I think, in BattleTech. Everybody kind of know what it does, and I'll give a quick like synopsis of it. So it was signed in 2412. 2412 is an interesting era in the BattleTech universe. It predates Mechs. There was almost like unlimited expansion going out from Terra. So you had a situation where, a lot of the great houses that were like established by this time would go like spiral outwards and, forge alliances with other kind of powers around them to create, to fold them into their power base. And that effectively happens for years and years. That's why you have these massive states like the Free Worlds League, the Capellan Confederation. They're basically like amalgamated units. It's like one dominant power base in that region just kind of swallows up through like military activity or through negotiating whatever, and then they kind of formulate their own countries. And because of the way that space is, obviously it's huge, and people can just go out there and pioneer, right? So you can just go out there and start your own, you find a moon somewhere and start your own colony up, and then in 300 years it's a pretty significant force in that particular area. So it's a really, like, it's an interesting time, obviously. But what you have eventually is when you kind of get into the periphery, and keep like at this time there's no like HPG networks. So it's not like you've got like a centralized authority. Eventually you do get that, and the Star League like kind of solidifies all that. But this time it's real Wild West out there, and you've got a situation. It's quite a brutal situation where, like, let's say the Fed Sons and the Capellans are at war with each other. Well, rather than like the Fed Sons, just allowing the Capellans to like have a planet in space, which is kind of seen as a strategic asset for the Capellans, all you'd do is you'd get warships and go and nuke the planet, because that's far easier than for you to than to have the ground battle for it. So you had this like horrifying situation where forces would just commit unrestricted terror to each other, whether it was nuclear or biological weapons or whatever, just to kind of give the other side, a lesser strategic advantage over you. I mean, it wasn't always like this. Like, they would fight over resources, and sometimes, assets were too valuable to bomb. But generally speaking, it was just kind of seen as an acceptable thing to do, to just go and murder like worlds. So pretty horrifying. Probably in terms of like casualties, it probably wasn't as bad as you think, because a lot of these colonies, like, they wouldn't have been like as big as Earth, right? They might have only been several thousand people on there. I say only. I mean, it's still horrific beyond reckoning. But what I'm saying is, like, it's not like they're wiping out colonies necessarily with 8 billion people. In fact, generally speaking, that would have been insane, because that would have had tons of like resources and other things on there. Where the fear really crept in for humanity during this time, and it all came about ironically through a Capellan called Alicia Liao, who basically asked the question: if we keep going, we're going to go extinct. Like, are we just going to nuke? Like, okay, so you nuke the strategical assets that don't have much worth, but when does that escalation stop? When is it that the Lyrans just start deciding, oh, we're just going to go and nuke all the Draconis Combine planets, turn them into an irradiated wasteland on our borders, so that we don't have to share a border with them, and then the Draconis Combine do the same? So it's literally, it's like a blueprint for Armageddon. And they kind of knew this, and it was like, oh, we really need to kind of pull back on this and stop this from being a really terrifying, horrible thing, which not so much, it wouldn't have destroyed humanity, you would have had pockets of humanity, but it would have just caused a massive like decrease in the human, how do I put this? The journey of, like, the collective journey will have just been cut off. You will have just had almost like a 40k universe, where you've got that period of time where the I mean, I don't know 40k lore that well, but it's similar, where like all pockets of humanity are just kind of completely distanced from each other, and they just create their own like feudal societies for a few thousand years before the Emperor shows up and unifies them into the into the greater good of the Imperium, or whatever they call it. Whereas in BattleTech, it's very much like they knew that was probably going to happen. So to stop that, Alicia Lau basically said, look, let's get around the table and put restrictions on warfare, which is a sensible thing to do. Who would disavow that as a, would you rather have mass civilian casualties or not? I mean, you've got to be a monster to say otherwise, right? However, there were two powers that didn't sign it, but it wasn't because they were monsters. One for a philosophical complaint, and one because they didn't trust the Capellans, which is wise. It was the United Hindu Collective who basically didn't sign it because they thought that gave justification to like standard warfare, which is true, but I think that's an incredibly naive decision to take, because would you rather have limited warfare or unrestricted warfare. I mean, it's the real world, right? We can't get around that wars happen. So, yeah. Anyway, but that was the way that they thought. The Taurians, though, were very much like, yeah, this is just a plot to kind of, Capellan plot to steal land. They were kind of got proved right as well, because it was the Capellans who actually broke the the Ares Convention, but we'll talk about that in a second. Where though you've got a problem with the Ares Convention, because again, the 10 of, I think it was 10 of 12. Can't remember. I think it's 10 of 12. But the ones that signed it adhered to it for approximately 10 years. As I intimated before, it was the Capellans who broke it. Shock, they broke it against the Taurians. So technically they didn't break it, but you'd think because they instigated it, they would have had the good sense to kind of toe the party line, because the second they break it, well, everyone's going to do it, given that they were the ones that came up with the idea. And they, I mean, I can't remember the story off the top of my head, but they basically just nuke or commit unrestricted warfare against the Taurians to do a land grab. So, yeah, there you are, typical Capellans. What I'd say, though, is that the problem is with the Ares Convention, and it's a significant problem, and this is where my theory kind of comes in now, is that it had no teeth until something we'll talk about, which is very important. We'll talk about that in a second. And I need to go back to the Peace of Westphalia for a second before I kind of get into this theory. So when I spoke about the Peace of Westphalia, I talk about that underpinning of like 100 years of Enlightenment thought through people like Erasmus, right? Not just Erasmus. There were plenty of people like writing and talking about like a new way of doing things at the time. But there was a philosophical teeth, like a real like a blueprint to enforce what the Peace of Westphalia became. And the Ares Convention, when it was signed, which was signed a few decades before the BattleTech came a thing, had no teeth. So it was basically just broken after 10 years. It wasn't. I'll talk about shortly why it was broken completely and who broke that. But it was semi-adhered to. But my theory is this: much like the philosophy of the Enlightenment forged the modern world through things like the Treaty of Westphalia, the BattleTech forged the concept of the Ares Convention. There was no signatures put on a page talking about this. It's the thing that happened in human technological evolution that gave the Ares Convention teeth. And the BattleTech was that. The BattleTech was almost like the linchpin for going forward for humanity, not basically extinguishing its light out of the galaxy. And why is that the case? Well, the second that the BattleTech gets created, so the story is very famous, right? The Mech gets created, all the inner sphere powers then kind of steal the blueprints from it and make their own, and within 30, 40, 50 years, every inner sphere, every major power and minor power has got BattleTechs, and that gives what the Ares Convention wanted to be, which is to move from unrestricted warfare to a more limited form of warfare. That's mech combat, right? And if you kind of create then, and this is the magic of BattleTech then, like merging those kind of mechs with the wider wonderful universe, galaxy, whatever you want to call it, that it all sits in, the mechs then become the method of doing limited warfare. So again, just to re-emphasize that point, the Enlightenment was the teeth of the Treaty of Westphalia. The BattleTech is the teeth of the Ares Convention. And you see that right up until present day in the BattleTech universe, where powers and people will sort their problems out through mech warfare. So you get to a planet, right? It does happen occasionally in BattleTech, like when the clans invaded, planets were nuked. But generally speaking, I say that I should be fair and say that inner sphere powers nuke each other as well, because the Ares Convention doesn't apply technically anymore in the BattleTech universe. Again, I'll talk about that in a second. But That's never seen as a good option. What is seen as a much better option is either using like a mercenary force as a proxy, with who, you know, will have lots of battle mechs and everything else, and you can basically fight over a city or an area or a planet or whatever, doing almost like honourable combat, because mechs, remember, are basically like electronic steeds, and the mech jocks or the mech warriors, whatever you want to call them, they are the the knightly class, and that's absolutely how it kind of got sold. You know, in the early days and of like the Star League, it was like these are, you know, we it's the way that people in like the 1960s used to view like race car drivers, or people in, you know, the World War One felt about airplane fighters, or people in the medieval times thought about people like the Black Prince, you know, like these chivalric people who, you know, were kind of, you know, bringing warfare to like an honourable level. And that's what the BattleTech did. It forced the whole concept of warfare to be footed on this not just honour, but also, again, the restriction of it. So it wasn't just throw things into a meat grinder, although that absolutely does happen in BattleTech. I'm not being idealistic about this. It's just that the BattleTech gives a higher ethos to think of, much like the Treaty of Westphalia did. Like, once the Treaty of Westphalia is out of the box, you can't put it back in. You can't say to people at that point, okay, well, if you do, obviously there's been a massive collapse in the way of thinking. If it's just like, if one power goes against it and said, actually, I don't care, I'm going to invade my neighbour because they are evil, because they follow a different religion, everyone around them is like, oh, not again, we've got to stop, we've got to close these people down. And it's kind of why, you know, in from a battle mech point of view, when you've got battle mechs in your army and you've got people that can fight these like restricted warfares, and you know, and it is through combined arms as well. Again, I'm not being naive about it. It's not like the cities don't get destroyed or civilian casualties don't happen. They absolutely do. But it's way, way, way better than what was prior, which was just nuke them, right? So again, just on a pragmatic level, there's a massive improvement. It's like the Treaty of Westphalia, the Peace of Westphalia was not perfect. You know, we'd look at it now and be like, why did they put that in there? But at the time, it was a massive step up. But again, you always need something to underpin it. And I equate this, the example that I want to give now as to why, and I think it's an important example this as well, in terms of what I've talked about here. And I'll give that, and then I'll talk about like why the Ares Convention actually failed and who killed it, basically. But the example I want to give is on the steam engine, which, and it annoys me, this, because I used to know this fact when I was a kid, and I used to say it to people, and people always used to be like, that's really interesting. Well, subsequently, everyone's found out about this now, so it's no longer my little unique thing that I used to tell people. So the chances are you've probably heard about it. But when I was a kid, I used to be able to ask people, do you know when the steam engine was invented? And people would always kind of give the usual 19th, 18th century answers. And the answer is the steam engine was actually created by the ancient Greeks, not as a train, right? So it wasn't like the trains that we know and love today. It was very like rudimentary. I mean, I'm guessing just like a car on a, you know, some kind of track with a steam operated device that made the thing go. And this is obviously, when you think about it, like, steam is just a power source, or can be used as a power source. So, and they had the ability to make steam, obviously, so they just put two and two together. Imagine if that had have been a thing then, right? Imagine if we'd have had like the Industrial Revolution in ancient Greece. Things to think about anyway. But it didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Because they invented it. Well, the person that invented it went to one of the, I can't remember which king it was, one of the Greek kings in one of the city-states, showed him it. The king was absolutely amazed, turned around to the inventor and said, burn it and pretend that you never invented it. And when he asked why, the king said, because what would we do with the slaves? Right? Like, you'd literally take all the work off them, and then we'd have rebellions, and it would be a complete mess. My point with this is, though, that in order for something to take off, whether it's a theory or a scientific innovation or whatever it is, there must be political endeavour to get it really kind of into the forefront. And also you must have, like in the case of what I've spoken about here, you must have the underpinnings of like a strength of force behind it. And that's why the Peace of Westphalia endeavoured and still, you know, is maintained to this day and underpins all international relations. But it had 100 years of Enlightenment thought to fall back on, and the elites were thinking about these questions of like, well, what, you know, the difference between the superstitious ethos and the data empirical rational ethos. The Treaty of Ares is fascinating because it comes before the BattleMech. The BattleMech then just springs up a few decades later, and lo and behold, the Treaty of Ares, even though it's been completely trounced and no one really gives a damn about it anymore, it's suddenly got real teeth and real power because it's got the underpinnings of strength underneath what the philosophy is, if you want to put it that way. And then ironically, and it's a great irony because everyone kind of dotes on the Star League. The Star League are the ones that absolutely destroy the concept of the Ares Convention. This was a very famous event. It's when the Star League basically got a lot of ire and problem from the periphery powers who never fully bought into the Star League, especially the Taurians. Does always come back to the Taurians when there are issues in the inner sphere and the periphery. It's not their fault. It's just the way that they are. They're a very independent people. So when they get told you've got to be part of a collective authority or else, they usually take the or else option. And when they were really kind of going up, I mean, again, this is a story for another day, but it's quite a famous story. When the Taurians kind of kicked off against it, and the SLDF, with Kerensky was sent out there to kind of, you know, subjugate it. The reunification wars, basically they trounced the Ares Convention, like whatever else was left of it in terms of a written philosophy that people had adhered to, it was just basically removed because they knew that in order to get the Taurians back on side, they'd have to commit, I don't want to say that the Star League went in there and brutalised people, but the Star League was very much of the old Teddy Roosevelt theory, which was, you know, walk softly and carry a big stick. And their big stick was enormous. Like, it was the entire power of the SLDF and all the kind of mech battalions and regiments and the greatest force in human history. So they were incredibly powerful and incredibly dominant, and that whole period of history was usually the central powers of the SLDF kept all the great houses in check because the great houses knew that they really didn't want to go up against them because of the power of that central military. The Taurians, though, just assumed, well, we're kind of right on the outskirts of this, so we can get away with causing a lot more trouble than the inner sphere powers, which was true and not true. I mean, obviously the reunification wars, you know, I mean, the periphery powers did themselves very proud because they're much smaller, but ultimately they had no chance against the SLDF, right? So, you know, but to get the SLDF to where they needed to get to put these periphery powers down, the Ares conventions were anything left on them that had been, and I'm sure that this hasn't been written about specifically, but what you'll find is with laws and treaties that they'll get kind of put into other aspects of law. So it's like, you know, treaty on the Ares Convention, sub-article 15, paragraph 3, you'll just adopt that into another thing. Well, those things were suspended. So that's where you could then get away with committed unrestricted warfare. It's probably the reason that, again, the SLDF did a lot of things that laid the foundation for just unbelievable levels of horror, like the invasion of the clans, which were the SLDF in exile that came back and, you know, committed unrestricted warfare against the inner sphere at that time. But by doing what they did, by getting rid of all the kind of concepts of the Ares Convention and just throwing it out, they laid the foundations for the succession wars as well, which was, you know, a several 100-year period of history that was just utterly brutal, caused basically humanity to bomb themselves back into the Stone Age. You know, they lost all their warships, which, you know, I suppose you could argue that is a good thing because the warships were incredibly destructive, but still, you know, it's good to have warships if they are used correctly and for defensive reasons, not necessarily to go and wage war on your neighbours. So yeah, it's a complicated thing, and you know the way that the Ares Convention was thrown out, the spirit of it though, and I'll leave it with this thought, and then I'll kind of end the video. But the battle mechs are kind of the soul of the Ares Convention, if you want to kind of put it that way. So the body may not exist anymore, but the soul perseveres, and it perseveres in the battle mechs, where there is still an honour and duty, and you know, and not all. I mean, obviously, people can absolutely abuse the concept of mechs and can completely put them into like unrestricted warfare. But generally speaking, you can act through proxy, right? It's the reason why the Free Worlds League uses mercenaries so often, because they're fighting through proxy, and the mercenaries have got no interest in going to nuke nations or, you know, planets or populous areas or anything like that, because they're there to make money. So you get, you know, the other side might have a merc force as well, or they might be using someone in their, you know, kind of force military or whatever. But the fact that it's like a self-contained little fight, and you've got these mech jocks who have kind of got an honor code and, you know, all that good stuff, just really kind of pushes things into a different sphere. Anyway, that's the end of the video. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Go and read about the Peace of Westphalia. It's very interesting. If you don't know much about it, well worth a little bit of research. I do like doing these videos. As I go through my kind of back catalogue of BattleTech books, I'll probably find quite a few more videos to do like this. I've got a little bit of like a running list. But I just think BattleTech is so much richer than like, oh, it was basically it's like the fall of the Roman Empire and then the succession wars of the Dark Ages, and it's stuff that just gets like parroted so much throughout the community. And yes, there's a lot of truth in this, but it's much richer than that. There are far more interesting, you can do more historical like allegories of like what is occurring across BattleTech, or you can do kind of echoes. So it's very similar to that. And you know, history is just, I mean, history is insane when you think about the narratives that are involved in it. I mean, there's just so much that people could write about or analyse, and to do it with something like BattleTech is actually really quite an interesting thing to do, because the people who wrote for BattleTech were by definition into their history. So yeah, something I'll certainly do over the course of the next year anyway, so watch this space. Anyway, I will thank you all for watching, and I'll hopefully catch you again next time.